Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to continue with our program. I'm Milan Ježovica, I'm Senior Fellow at MESA 10, a Bratislava-based think tank. It is our distinct pleasure and honor to continue our discussion with His Excellency Milo Đukanović, the Prime Minister of Montenegro. Mr. Prime Minister, can I please ask you? Prime Minister Đukanović does not need an introduction at Globsec. He was with us last year at a Globsec Chat, which was initiated and moderated by Pavel Demeš. Prime Minister Đukanović, has also been an institution in Montenegro. He's been on the political scene of Montenegro for a period spanning over 22 years. Serving as a president, he is now serving his fourth term as the Prime Minister, and we are glad that we have an opportunity to talk to him today. Prime Minister, welcome. Dobar dan I dobrodošli, gospodine premijeru.
Hvala, gospodine Ježović, bolje vas našao.
With that, let's start with our questions. We've spoken about anniversary of this year's, which we are celebrating or commemorating. There's one that I'd like to draw some attention to. Exactly 25 years ago, in May of 1989, side by side with Chancellor Kohl, the United States President George Bush said in his Europe, Whole and Free speech the following, and I'll quote: "We want to help the nations of Eastern Europe realize what we, the nations of Western Europe, learned long ago. The foundation of lasting security comes not from tanks, troops, or barbed wire. It is built on shared values and agreements that link free peoples." Mr. Prime Minister, as you look at that period of 25 years, how do you assess the events that have taken place, especially in the Western Balkans?
Prije svega hvala vam na ovoj.
First of all, thank you for this extraordinary opportunity to give some information dealing with the present and future of Montenegro and the region we live in. Over the past 25 years, the West Balkan countries have made progress in economic terms, also in terms of building democracy. I dare say that today Western Balkans has never been more stable, more European. I recall that Slovenia and Croatia have in the meantime become members of EU and NATO, and also that Montenegro and Serbia are today conducting negotiations with the EU on their membership. I will recall that Macedonia has a candidate status too with the EU, and Albania is likely to soon get the same status. Albania is also, let's recall, a NATO member state. What also needs to be mentioned is the progress that has in the meantime happened in the relationship between Belgrade and Pristina. That is one of the three inherited issues, open issues, from the time of the last crisis in ex-Yugoslavia. Now this issue is on a positive track. This is a process certainly which will call for time, but it is important that this process has now got underway, not to make the picture that idyllic. Let's mention two still outstanding issues inherited from the ex-Yugoslavia's crisis. The first issue is the issue of insufficiently functioning Bosnia, which prevents Bosnia to more strongly move along the path of Europe-Atlantic orientation. And then the issue of Macedonia, which has lasted since the Bucharest summit, when Macedonia was deadlocked and prevented from becoming a NATO member state. These issues are a burden on the stability of the Western Balkans, and these issues can, over time, call into question the stability of the Western Balkans after the last crisis in ex-Yugoslavia. We need to know that we are now in the 19th year since the Dayton Accord, and today, when we look back at the past 19 years, they could have been better used, particularly in terms of defining better responses to the still outstanding issues, and creating more reliable stability as a prerequisite for dynamic European and Atlantic integration of all these countries.
Wonderful. Let's continue with the challenges that we are facing. And of course, for us, the Slovaks, but not only for us, the Slovaks, what is happening and what has happened in Ukraine is of grave concern to us. And we are now in a year of not only celebrations and commemorations, but we are actually in a year which is marked by shaking of the world order and the fundamental principles on which it has been built. Russia's annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of Ukraine thus pose very difficult questions and, of course, challenges ahead of us. What is the impact that the Russian action and Russian policy has on the region of the Western Balkans and on your country, Mr. Prime Minister?
I think that the crisis in Ukraine has come as an awakening call. All of us in Europe have been warned. We took too early for granted stability in the European continent, and we thought that we could just turn to issues of establishing better relations with the Far East. Of course, we need to work closely with all prosperous parts of the world, but what matters is to first take care of the crucial issues of our home, and that is the issue of European stability. There is no need to particularly stress that the crisis in Ukraine has an impact on the Western Balkans, and not only because of a long history and tradition of relations between Russia and each of individual countries in the Western Balkans, but because since 1990s in the Balkans, in this part of the Balkans, there are two courses of politics between countries in the Western Balkans are clashing strongly. One course of European and Atlantic integration, and it needs to be noted, in 1990s, perhaps for the first time, that area saw their future in more or less the same way. Before that, the views from various parts of the Western Balkans were very different with respect to their future. Now, with the Ukraine crisis, it seems to me that there is again room for restoration of some ideas that we seemed to think belong to the past, to misguided historic myths, and which caused to recurrence of instabilities and crises, most often with tragic consequences that we saw in 1990s in ex-Yugoslavia. That's why I think that it is now very important that, especially against this backdrop in Ukraine, of Ukraine crisis, that we join forces everywhere in Europe, in the US, in this transatlantic alliance, so that we strengthen a clear European and Atlantic perspective of all Balkan societies. The governments of all these states should be helped. All these states who see their future in European and Atlantic integration, these governments should be helped into moving even more courageously into fulfilling all the tasks which will make us in a early future, an integral part, organic part of European Atlantic community. This is particularly important now when we still have not built up enough case to present to the people the benefits of European and Atlantic integration. I will illustrate this by the example of Montenegro. In the period since 22 and 2012, Montenegro tripled its GDP per capita. This appears impressive. Today we have the highest per capita GDP in the Western Balkans. But if I tell you that it is just 5,300 euros per capita, then it means that we are just 1/5 of the average European GDP. We are on a good track, and I think that we even have a good pace. But regrettably, due to this poor legacy, we are faced with various attempts to see restoration of some mistakes from history.
Thank you very much. Exactly, looking for the guarantees, for security guarantees, was one of the reasons why Slovakia and other Central European countries have joined the European Union and the North Atlantic Alliance, because we simply didn't want to be an object of international relations. As we are looking at Montenegro on both these tracks, in the negotiations with the European Union, you have opened 9 negotiation chapters, and there is a constant traffic between Podgorica and Brussels. And looking at your trips and your communication with the United States, you've been recently to Washington. Your Deputy Prime Minister for Justice visited the United States. Your Minister of Interior was in the United States. Your Foreign Minister was in the United States. What's your take on these visits and how much you have accomplished on your way to being able to receive an invitation, and what remains to be done?
I would like to stress the quality of relationship of Montenegro with Europe and with the US. I think that a lot in our relationship is based on a sincere trust built in the difficult years of crisis in ex-Yugoslavia. I will recall precisely that time Montenegro as the smallest, the least developed, and at the same time pronouncedly multi-ethnic, managed to preserve peace, regrettably as the only ex-Yugoslav republic, despite the fact that all across our borders, there were ethnic and religious wars. At that time, Montenegro was largely qualified as an oasis of multi-ethnic democracy. I'm glad that such a vision is now being implemented across the Western Balkans. What seemed like an impossible mission in the 1990s is now becoming reality. You mentioned that over the past 8 years since restoration of independence, we have achieved significant progress in European and Atlantic integration. Montenegro is today leading European integration in the Western Balkans, the European integration process, and today it is on the doorstep of NATO. In our view, Montenegro has either fulfilled or is about to fulfill the very last preconditions that should make us eligible for an invitation for the Wales summit of NATO. There are a lot of challenges ahead in the run-up to the summit, and the key challenges, not only for Montenegro, but for the entire region, is the issue of economic and democratic development. Through our experience to date, we have noted various shortages, weaknesses in the Balkans. One of the deficits is deficits of tolerance in the Balkans for diversities. And I believe that this is due to are lagging behind in economic terms, in terms of democratic development, and that's why Montenegro is today focused on creating prerequisites for dynamic economic growth, and I think that we have every possibility to catch up with Europe in terms of living standards. Of course, the issue of capacity is key to this. Capacities, administrative administrative capacities included are a problem of any transition society. Montenegro is a state which has been here for just 8 years, but we have enacted many laws, but the key issue is to put our capacities in place in order that the system could fully function in order to protect, to implement European standards and interests.
Let me take it also from a different angle. In 2001, when President Václav Havel was here in Bratislava, he expressed the very prophetic words, and this is the following explanation that he had, how he explained what a decision not to include the countries of Central and Eastern Europe into the alliance, what did it amount to? And I quote, "In short, to rededicating ourselves to the old principle of dividing the world and nations regardless of their will. It would, in fact, be a denial of the underlying concept of the Washington Treaty, NATO's fundamental document, that is, of the conviction that democratic countries of the Euro-Atlantic region have the right to freely choose the way in which they wish to protect their freedom, and that the alliance should be made accessible to them if they opt for collective defense." And my question is, well, if by the virtue of the Washington Treaty, the alliance has an open door policy, wouldn't it be both logical and useful if that door were open to admit yet another new member of the alliance? And vice versa, what would happen if the alliance, which has spent a considerable effort together with the countries that are trying to be members, what if the alliance were to say no and lose this joint effort? What if we were to say to the countries of the Western Balkans that actually, in spite of our saying that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, there is no light at the end of the tunnel?
Odlično se sjećam tog beskompromisnog stava.
I remember very well that uncompromising position by President Havel, and with respect, I recall very well his very consistent advocating that position in regard to the example of Montenegro. When Montenegro wanted to decide on its future in a democratic referendum, at that time there was not an excess of understanding in many capitals across the world. We need to recall, at that time there was a dominant fear from a possible recurring instability in the Balkans because of the Montenegrin aspiration to restore independence. Today, we are speaking primarily of an issue of European and Atlantic interest, and less of the interests of any individual state, and less of the interests of the entire West Balkan region I come from. I think that unification of Europe is a mission. This is a mission that should represent the interest of every European state, every European people, and Europe as a whole. In order to be globally competitive, Europe must be stable and must make good use of all its resources, which means it must be whole, it must be united. That's why it seems superfluous to me that we from the Balkans need to recall Europe, that it should pay attention to this, and that while saying that the door of Europe is open, that Europe should accompany this with additional efforts and help countries from the Western Balkans to go through this door. This door from Europe was open in 1990s, but Yugoslav peoples decided to go with their head through the wall, and this was not a problem just for us, but this was also, despite the most drastic consequences for us, this was a serious problem for Europe and from NATO too. That's why unification of Europe is a mission that Europe should be interested in too. I think equally about NATO. I think that on both sides of the Atlantic we allow to us to be too relaxed when cherishing a mutual relationship was. We were just rushing who will reach Far East more quickly. It seemed that we had changed our priorities. The crisis of Ukraine seems to me as an awakening call, especially in regard of the role of the Euro-Atlantic alliance globally. That's why I think that continuation of NATO expansion is an imperative. And I think this is primarily in the interest of NATO, in the interest of Europe, and of course, this is in the best interest of the countries of the Western Balkans. And I think that it is very dangerous to leave yet again the West Balkan to its own devices, unintegrated. We have seen what such a situation can lead to when these states are left without sufficient attention by the Euro-Atlantic Alliance. The experience from 1990s is still fresh in our memories. So we have plenty of evidence that instruments of stability of the Western Balkans, internal instruments, are not reliable enough, and we need to reinforce them. And Montenegro is excellent for keeping alive this process. After accession of Croatia to the EU, there seems to be a lull, a stall in the implementation of a vision, and there is a threat that we might lose this vision. So that's why this process, I think, needs to be kept alive. Montenegro, luckily, seems to have fulfilled all the requirements. What we need now is a bit of attention in key European capitals in order to do what needs to be done to extend an invitation to Montenegro from the Wales summit.
Several countries, including the countries of the Visegrad Four, are supporting European and transatlantic integration of Montenegro. They are doing it because it's in their interest, because it's in interest of Europe, and because it's in the interest of the transatlantic. What do you think that those countries should do to be helpful to you or continue to do? And on the other hand, how can you reciprocate their support with doing everything that is needed to be ready to receive an invitation?
I primarily wish to thank these countries that you have mentioned because they have indeed done a great deal to date in promoting European and Atlantic future of the Western Balkans and advocating continuation of the enlargement policy and demonstrating readiness to transfer their positive experience and expertise on Montenegro and other states, which, as I've said, have a problem of shortage of capacity and experience in the integration process. I've had pleasure over the past 2 or 3 days of meeting 3 prime ministers from Visegrad Group, prime ministers of Poland, Slovakia and Czech Republic. I was pleased to hear their undivided support for Montenegro's aspirations towards NATO and Montenegro's expectation that already from the next summit it receives an invitation for us. Any support of a NATO member state is invaluable. I think, however, support of new 12 NATO member states carries a particular weight, and we will be talking to each of them, and I expect that in the near future we will have clear demonstration of unity of all these countries in terms of supporting Montenegro. On the other hand, experience of the Visegrad Group countries has been very helpful for us. Many a positive experience that we can use. And I particularly highlight a mutual cooperation between the Visegrad Group countries. And I think that this is something which is still lacking among the West Balkan countries. Good good mutual cooperation, even given the level of cooperation that we have. And I think that we are going into a next phase of more intensive mutual cooperation that Montenegro is strongly initiative. And I think that positive experience of Visegrad Group can be strongly emulated. Slovakia is a unique example of relationship with a new country. Not only that Slovakia had huge merits in our referendum process when we restored independence, but Slovakia has always shared all its experiences through our difficult challenges.
I'd like to give the floor to the auditorium, but allow me just one last question, and I'd like to be a little bit more personal. You've been on the Montenegrin political scene for a formidable 22 years, but you also knew when to step down. In 2006, you left the office. You did the same in 2010. You knew that there was a need for new blood, but you also felt that there was a need for you to come back. And this is no way to write you a political obituary here in Bratislava at Globsec, but what keeps you running? What kind of a legacy do you want to hammer out while being in the seat of Prime Minister?
Thank you for recalling this. Indeed, in 2006 and 2010, I stood down from government office with the same motivation. I felt that an important job had been done and that we are in for a new phase, and that the component part of that different phase must be build-up of institutions. So I started from the assumption that Montenegrin society is strongly traditionalist, and throughout our long history, we tended more to rely on individual rather than institutional authority. So I had in mind that I was in the limelight of various of the events over many of those past years, so I felt that my best contribution could be by leaving government and helping it by my advice as needed, while leaving broad space for institutional development. As you noticed, I came back twice, always at some critical moments, and believing that my experience could be of help. But I agree with you that, and I believe that what I did, I already proved that I needed to think that, and I have to think of that time which is impending, and which should inaugurate a new phase of intensive economic and democratic development of Montenegro. I am pleased that we can say that we have restored independence, and that today Montenegro is in charge of its future, of its destiny, and Montenegro is politically stable, secure, a multi-ethnic society which can no longer lose its way into stumbling upon some dead alleys. There are challenges of economic growth. We want a dynamic growth. That is a challenge which could be achievable in a near future. This challenge in terms of membership of NATO is, I believe, achievable soon, in a near future, and I think it would strengthen the stability of the Balkans and also strengthen the stability and clear European perspective of our society.
Thank you very much. Now we have space for questions from the audience. Do I see any hands? There's one here. Another one over there. Bruce?
I want to follow up on Milan's question about the debate on NATO that we're coming up. Obviously, in Washington, it's a big issue. The Department of Defense and the intelligence community have completed their analysis, and they've swung to support an invitation at Wales. There's still a couple of outstanding questions. One of them is a question about Russian influence, management, property ownership, its presence in Montenegro. How can you, what is the level of Russian influence and ownership and the presence of Russian money in Montenegrin politics?
Hvala vam na postavljenom pitanju.
Thank you for this question. Indeed, I've often had a chance of answering similar questions. I think there is a kind of doubt in some of the Euro-Atlantic community whether influence of Russia in Montenegrin economy and politics is such as to threat Montenegrin perspective to become in a near future member state of NATO and the EU. This is, I think, absolutely an overemphasized danger. Let me not just stay with political answers. Let me just illustrate with some figures. Between 2002 and 2012, the share of Russian investment in Montenegro was 14%. In the same period, the share of investment from the EU was 45%. In the meantime, Russian investment in Montenegro fell significantly owing to the fact that the Russian investors left the aluminium industry as the most important industry. That was their most expensive investment. They left that investment not for political reasons, but because of their mismanagement of that asset, which led to the bankruptcy of that company, and through the bankruptcy of the company, Montenegro came into repossession of the shares. Of course, there are Russian tourists, Russian investors in Montenegro. There are purchases by Russians of flats or houses where people from Russia, like from other countries, buy real property, but this altogether can by no means represent a danger from possible unprincipled influence Montenegrin politics. Montenegro restored independence 8 years ago, but we have a long statehood tradition. Montenegrins are very proud of their statehood, of their nation. Montenegrins are people who think that they have every right to articulate their national interest, and we have done so. We want to be part of EU and NATO. We don't think that we should quarrel or argue with anyone or end some friendship, but we have by no means chosen to be part of NATO and EU because we want to be anti-Russian. I recently could read such statements from coming from Russian Foreign Ministry after my visit to Washington. We are not guided by positions anti-anybody. We are simply following our own interests and pursuing our own interests. And we think that Montenegrin national interests are in the best hands when they are within European and Atlantic framework.
Wonderful. There was a second question over there.
Dobar dan, Jelena Milić iz Srbije. Ja u stvari nemam toliko pitanje.
This is not so much a question. I just want to use this opportunity to support Montenegro into becoming, as early as possible, a member of NATO. I think that this would facilitate the job of Serbia, which had started on a progressive path, but not because of interest of Russian investment, but Russian money which entered many areas of the society, media included. So the rhetoric on NATO is now hostile to this. I think that Montenegrin clear position on Ukraine has laid bare Russian diplomatic stance and the way they conduct themselves towards senior officials. I think that Serbia has chosen a government which is sincerely committed to moving into EU. If we look at what Russians are doing to us in Serbia, I think that whether people in Montenegro are clear about this, that this would be in their best interest to continue with the European and Euro-Atlantic process.
Hvala vam najprije na podršci i zaista želim da se složim sa vama da bi...
Thank you for your support. I wish to agree with you that stability and overall perspective of democratic and economic development of the region, for that perspective, it would be very important to keep alive, to keep a good pace of the process of integration in our region. And at this moment, the most realistic move would be through an invitation extended to Montenegro from the summit. As I answered, as I said a little while ago, answering a previous question, is that both Montenegro and Serbia are in a candidate status with the EU. And I think that in this way we will be providing good example to others to emulate by supporting regional cooperation. I think that close regional cooperation will prove that we are eligible for closer cooperation within a broader framework. Answering your question, I wish to say, and not just for courtesy, say out of courtesy, that for the stability of our region it is crucial that Serbia should catch up with the process of European and Atlantic integration. There is no need to prove in particular, to highlight that Serbia's role is important in view of the fact that it is the biggest in the region, the biggest state. And if Serbia is moving at a strong pace, we will all move forward more swiftly. And it would be very good if Serbia were to dictate this pace of moving forward. With regard to the public opinion, the situation in the public opinion has made significant progress over the past year and a half. We have strengthened support for NATO membership significantly, according to the last opinion poll, most recent. It stands at 46% for NATO accession. So if we compare with other states, many other states had lower support for NATO membership when they had an extended invitation. So I think that after an invitation, we would have a significant surge of support.
There is another question. If it's a very quick question, I'll take it. We are running late. Please, 30 seconds. Can you? Okay, go ahead.
I don't know whether the answer comes in 30 seconds.
Well,
you mentioned the dysfunctionality of Bosnia, and that's obviously a problem for the whole region. What advice would you offer to the European Union, and what advice would you offer to the Bosnian government about sorting out the problems?
And you require a 30-second response to that, yeah? Mr. Prime Minister?
It would be really presumptuous, especially with 30 seconds, to offer such advice. But I wish to say that as neighbors, we feel that deficit of functionality of Bosnia in terms of its progress in European Atlantic integration. It's my impression that we have all kind of forgotten our obligations that we have undertaken when Bosnia is concerned. I do not want to relieve the political leaders in Bosnia of their responsibility. They should, of course, demonstrate greater responsibility towards our joint house. But we too, as as neighbors and the international community, we have our share of responsibility. Bosnia is an uncompleted task, unaccomplished, and I think that the international community will need to work to push things forward, and we must not tolerate further a dysfunctional Bosnia so that it could be a target of various interests which would call into question not only its survival, but let me say also the issue of stability in Europe.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for attending our chat with Prime Minister of Montenegro, and allow me on your behalf to thank His Excellency Milo Đukanović, the Prime Minister of Montenegro, for sharing his thoughts with us today. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you very much. Hvala puno.
Thank you very much.